Hello students, this video covers the poems in the Poems 2 readings and looks at how Gary Jackson uses superheroes as poetic metaphors. So a quick overview of Part 2. The poems that you read in Part 2 of the readings download will focus more on the world of superheroes. In these poems, look for the following themes as you read: the role of vengeance and justice, how the double identity of superheroes reflects a double identity of everyone, and how superheroes highly inflate the problems and desires that we all have. As we go through this slide, please stop and read each poem discussed before watching my discussion of it. This will help you follow along with the lecture and help you better understand what you are reading. First, let's look at the poem Upon Seeing Spider-Man on My Way to Work. As always, please stop this video and read the poem in Poems 2. Now that you're back, let's take a look and analyze the key parts of Upon Seeing Spider-Man on My Way to Work. What is the plot of this poem? This poem has the plot of a bystander in the Marvel comic book universe seeing Spider-Man swinging through Manhattan and evaluating his life in comparison to Spider-Man's. Setting: it takes place in a comic book version of New York City. For those unfamiliar, Spider-Man is a very famous New York City superhero in the Marvel Universe. Who is speaking? Well, again, we have an unnamed narrator, but this narrator represents one of the people in the background of Spider-Man comics. If we take a look, underneath this image of Spider-Man here, or underneath the comic image of Spider-Man here, our narrator would be one of these people in the background of the panel. Keywords and phrases, we will discuss those at a different time. Theme. The theme of this poem uses Spider-Man to discuss celebrity culture and how celebrity culture can cause overdue pain and feelings of worthlessness. As you've read the poem, the narrator sees Spider-Man and finds his life wanting in comparison. He does not see Spider-Man as a figure of aspiration and hope. He doesn't see Spider-Man as someone to look up to. He sees Spider-Man with a jealousy. Spider-Man makes him feel bad about his life. Despite the fact that our narrator has a wife, has a job, and can afford an apartment in New York City, he looks at Spider-Man and sees all that he doesn't have. And that doesn't give him something to aspire to, it gives him something to regret and feel jealous about. This is also a sense of irony. Anyone familiar with Spider-Man in the comics knows that Spider-Man is often a character who is struggling to pay his own rent. So the fact that our narrator can't see the true nature of Spider-Man, but only the reflection of Spider-Man's celebrity, says a lot about celebrity culture. So Spider-Man here is a metaphor of celebrity culture and how celebrity culture makes normal people feel worthless. Moving on, we will look at the poem The Golden Avenger. Please pause, take a moment, and read the poem. The poem The Golden Avenger, which many students will confuse to think of Iron Man or Thor, actually is talking about this character here, Dick Tracy. Dick Tracy is a very famous comic book from the 40s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. He is a detective who is known for his yellow coat and hat, and he was in a series of hard-boiled crime stories. In The Golden Avenger, what we have is a series of young boys listening to a radio story of the Golden Avenger. Before there were TVs, before there were superheroes or Marvel movies, in the United States there were radio shows. Radio shows often had cowboys and detective or crime shows. So our opening stanza talks to us about how young boys listen to Dick Tracy's adventure with an uncanny ear. They act alongside their radios, pretending to be him. They follow him on his adventures. They race down alleyways, hunting murderers and thieves. So, in the opening sections of this poem, what you have is our narrator talking to you about how children kind of can play cops and robbers. Now, the problem is, as we continue to read the poem, these children act out the idea that when things go wrong, as they always do, they pull out the gun and shoot a single beam. So they're acting out how in Dick Tracy stories, like many cop stories, they always have a violent conclusion. The cops will shoot the robbers. Now, the poem is presenting this idea with a sense of irony. It's showing that this is a dangerous idea, because what lesson are these children being told? They are being told that when things go wrong, and they always go wrong, it's okay to shoot someone. They are learning about a hero cop in the form of Dick Tracy that shoots first and asks questions later. As the poem concludes, this idea of the danger of stories that have acts of violence that always go wrong is fully described. The poem says it's a fiction, an escape, something we only dream of. But if someone felt compelled to become the fantasy, as long as he saved the right people, who cares who he hurts? This poem is underlining the idea that characters like Dick Tracy reinforce a fantasy version of police violence, where all the people who are hurt by police are bad people. Because if someone is compelled to act out cops and robbers like the kids listening to the radio, who cares who they shoot, as long as they save the right people? And that line is all about how, as a society, we justify violence. Normally in society, we have an idea that violence is bad, but not all violence. There's some violence that we feel is righteous and should be done. And this violence, as long as it's to save the right people, who cares who it hurts? This phrase, the right people, is highly charged because notice the right people can be anyone. And the people that are hurt can also be anyone. So this fiction of a heroic cop that children dream of being presents a dangerous fantasy of violence. It presents a poem that asks us to question the very nature of the heroes and the violence that they do. The Golden Avenger, Dick Tracy, his heroism is undercut by the fact that he supports a system of violence that is a fantasy, and that the reality of this violence, who the right people are and who the wrong people are, is much more complicated in real life. This theme of violence, of justified violence, becomes important in many of the poems in Poems 2. Now, if we think about violence, violence is something that historically society has always worked to reduce. Societies going all the way back throughout history set up rules and regulations about who can use violence, when violence is okay. This regulation of violence has been a distinguishing mark of society. When we talk about the role of justified violence, that is when we say that violence is okay to solve a problem, that we as society find it acceptable to use violence to solve an issue. In society, we see people like soldiers, police officers, and certain citizens in life-threatening situations sometimes are allowed by society to do violence to others. So if we return back to the Golden Avengers, we see this last stanza as a rhetorical question where Jackson wants the reader to question how society creates a culture of justified violence, and is this a good thing or a fantasy? The poem especially wants us to think about how heroes, like the police officer Dick Tracy, have access to a fantasy version of justified violence, where everyone hurt is a bad person, and everyone saved is the right person. Gothamites and Missing You Metropolis are two poems that take this idea of justified violence to its conclusion in Jackson's poems. These poems present the reader with the figure of Batman. Both of these poems, Gothamites and Missing You Metropolis, present the reader with two reactions to justified violence. One that supports justified violence and one that shows the reality of that violence. Both poems want you to question the idea that justified violence is okay as long as he saved the right people. Who cares what he hurts? So, let's talk briefly about the character of Batman. For many years, Batman had a dark gothic origin. The earliest Batman comics were gritty and almost horror comics. But for many, many years, Batman was this. He was much more family friendly. He was much more geared towards kids. He was colorful. The capers that he solved were oftentimes harmless. The Joker would steal the Eiffel Tower. The Riddler would have harmless riddles that Batman would solve easily. He was much closer to other heroes like Superman. But then in the 80s, Batman went from colorful, fun, and having a young boy sidekick to this version. In the 80s, Batman became a much darker version. This heralded back to his original roots as a gothic hero, but did it in an amplified manner. We had a Batman that was violent. We had a Batman that was scary. We have a Batman that is dark. We have a Batman that terrifies his Robin. We have a Batman covered in blood and a grimace set in stone. When you read the poem Missing You Metropolis, this is the Batman about which Gary Jackson is writing. It is this image that comes to save our narrator from the bank. So as you read Missing You Metropolis, have this image of Batman in your head. So, why does Gary Jackson use Batman as a symbol of justified violence? Well, we know that Batman is rich, he is white, and in the role of the comics, Batman is given the permission to use violence whenever and wherever he wants. In the standard tradition of comic book history, the cops permit Batman to help them solve crimes. They permit him to use his violence to stop bank robbers. Now, you can find some stories where Batman has been against the police of Gotham City, but for the most part, Batman is a metaphor for all of the people we in our society give the right to dole out violence against people that do wrong. So, please take a moment and read the poem Gothamites. Then return to this video and watch our discussion. Gothamites. Gothamites, the narrator is a citizen of Gotham City, almost the collective voice of Gotham City. For those unaware, Gotham City is the city where Batman lives. In the DC Comics universe, Gotham City is a stand-in for New York City. So the narrator here is a citizen of Gotham who is telling you, the reader, that the citizens of Gotham give Batman the right to do violence. In fact, not only do they allow him to do violence, they want him to do violence. And what the narrator of Gothamites tells you is that Batman is better than all of the other superheroes because he is a man who kicks ass. Let's look at some key lines. The narrator is the collective spirit of the city. He talks about how we have a bat, about how Batman is their man, about how they've heard rumors that Batman is just like one of them, who decided that he will take justice into his own hands. The narrator says that Batman is like all of us, but someone that is better. Batman is someone that the narrator says is scary or violent. They say that he's only a man, but not one boys dream about becoming. Our man keeps company with gargoyles, skulls, parapets, keeps time by the flapping of wings. So the narrator likes the fact that Batman is a violent, scary individual. And as we come towards the end of this discussion, Gothamites gives a praise of Batman's justified violence. The narrator is giving Batman the right to punish those who are wrong. It says, some of us bet he's even Gotham grown right here, but one of us, who just decided he was going to right a few wrongs, take this crime-fighting business into his own hands, show those other costumes how a man defends his home. So the poem wants you to understand that the citizens of Gotham have given Batman the justification to do violence, and to do extreme, scary violence, to beat people up like a man defending his home. Now, the poem itself does not question this, but if we read the context of the poem, we will see that Gary Jackson is arguing that this attitude is wrong and dangerous. So let's move on to the last poem in Poems 2, where this idea of Batman as doing violence, as Batman being given the right to do violence, be given a justification for violence, is questioned in the last poem. The last poem of Poems 2, Missing You Metropolis, is one of the most important poems that Gary Jackson included in his book. It presents a scene that you would see here. Batman saving a bunch of people from a violent robbery. So as you read the poem, stop the video and create a list of words and phrases that describe Superman in the poem. Ask yourself, what image do these words and phrases give you? Then write down all the words that describe Batman. Compare your list. What does your list say about the character of Superman? What does your list say about the character of Batman? So here we have some of the descriptions of Superman and Batman. So our teller, our narrator, who is a patron of the bank, sees Superman in his head. Superman does not save him. In the context of the poem, Superman is not there. Superman is only in the imagination of our narrator. And if you look at the words here, you see a picture of Superman that is bright, that is colorful, that uses ungloved hands to help, that flashes a reassuring wink or smile, letting our narrator think that everything would be all right. That is his dream of who we would like to have save him, his dream of what a true act of heroism would be, helping others. But the narrator does not have Superman saving him. The narrator in the plot of the poem only has Batman as his savior. And Batman is shown to be black and gray, to have a grimace set in stone. Our narrator hears the wet sounds of violence, of blood-soaked fists, of the onyx gleam of bat-shaped knives puncturing veins. These final lines of the poem refer back to the idea presented to you in The Golden Avenger. The last lines of the poem are the onyx gleam of bat-shaped knives as they puncture vein, giving blood to the fantasy. Remember, the last lines of The Golden Avenger are, it's a fantasy. As long as he saves the right people, who cares who he hurts? So the last lines of Missing You Metropolis not only talk about Gothamites, they also recontextualize the very idea of a fantasy that a justification of violence is something cut or dry, is black or white, is good or evil. So as we conclude, Missing You Metropolis undercuts the very notion of heroic violence, asks us to question the very idea of justified violence, and how we create a story of heroism around those who are given the right to do violence. It also shows how these heroes have an unintentional fallout. And it continues the trend found in the poem The Golden Avenger, asking the readers to question the role of those in power who commit violence for our safety. It's a picture of Batman that, as told to you in The Secret Art of Reading the Comics, forces you to question the whole nature of Batman's heroism, to see the blood and reality underneath the role of someone who does violence in the name of righting wrongs. This is the discussion of the poems in the Poems 2 folder.